Okay, here's my lecture on The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde is a very important major figure in British literature. Um, the Importance of Being Earnest is his most well-known work currently, although he wrote The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is a novel that is also well known, and several other plays. He wrote poetry. He was a journalist. I mean, he was kind of wrote in many different genres, and was really well known in his day, kind of like Dickens, or I mean, a lot of the writers we're talking about in the Victorian period were well known in their time, unlike some of the Romantic poets. Um, and was kind of he was a public figure. He was in ran around in art, the poetry or the the writer and art circles, and was extremely well known as a public figure. He was from an artistic, well-to-do Irish family, a kind of a bohemian, I guess you could call it nowadays, kind of hippie style sort of family in a sense, the artists, creative types. And So he was, he kind of floated in that world his whole life. His mother was an artist, and I think his father was a writer. I forget now if his father was a painter or a writer, but I know his mother was a painter. And As was his wife. He had was married and had several children, but he was also people will say he's gay, but he was bisexual. I mean, he had a wife and loved her dearly, but he also had numerous relationships with men. Um, so he is a really important figure, and his relationship with one of the younger men that he had a relationship with caused his downfall. He actually went to prison for that relationship because it was illegal to be gay. He The father of that particular person, his partner, his name was Lord Alfred Douglas. His father was the the Marquess of Queensberry, who was really, I mean, we're talking people way up in the social stratus, right? People with, titles and things. He knew about the relationship, and uh, what was like always publicly like calling Wilde out, and like basically Wilde eventually sued him for libel, saying that he was trying to ruin his reputation. The problem of which was that what he was being accused of was true. And so when they went through the libel trial, the Marquess of Queensberry was able to demonstrate that what he was saying was true, and therefore, instead of him being convicted for libel, Wilde was actually convicted for homosexuality and thrown in jail. So, like, it was like kind of redounded on him in a way he wasn't expecting. And all of this was started with the premiere of The Importance of Being Earnest, because the Marquess of Queensberry showed up that night and was going to like throw rotten vegetables at Wilde. People would often bring bouquets of flowers and things like that to the theater, and Wilde got wind of it and like refused to have him admitted to the theater, and so that just escalated Queensberry's attempts to call him out publicly. And so, in any case, it's a really odd sort of moment where the personal life sort of intersects with the art. Unfortunately, because I mean, in some ways, it doesn't affect the play. It has nothing to do with the play, but it's sort of an interesting. It's like the last thing he really wrote, the last play he wrote. And it was really, it was well regarded. It was popular. It ran for 86 days and eventually shut down because of all of the legal proceedings. Otherwise, it probably would have run a lot longer because it was very popular. And then he wrote from jail. He wrote a memoir that is a really well known. I know I read it in grad school, and it's a very good classic kind of example of a memoir called De Profundis. It's Latin, from the depths, or something to that effect. And so, anyways, he's a very influential figure. Now, he was influential in his time. I would say since then, that, he's sort of solidified into being considered an important figure in British lit. One of the reasons for that is because he's also a transitional figure between the Victorian period and what is coming in a modern period, which we'll be moving into fairly soon here. Okay, so a little bit about the play. I'm not going to talk here about the plot of the play. It's easy enough to follow what is going on. You have, it's a very clear play. The language is fairly easy. The footnotes are good in the text. The characters are delightful. There are film versions of this. It's often reproduced on stage. Very frequently, it's still in production, like quite often. I'm sure that, for example, you could go see it at Cincinnati Shakespeare one year. They're probably going to do it because it's, the kind of play that they would do. They do a lot of classic theater, and in fact, I'm sure I've seen it there before. Yeah, there's lots of possibilities with that, as well as film versions. The most famous of the most recent of which is a good version of it, and I recommend if you want to watch it, because it's just really funny and well performed with some good actors, is the 2002 version of it that stars Colin Firth and Rupert Everett and Judi Dench and Reese Witherspoon and Frances O'Connor. And it's a really delightful production that is very lighthearted and fun and really gets at sort of the spirit of the play, and with great performances. I mean, they're all really good in it. So if you're interested, if you like the play and you would like to see it, I recommend that version. I'm sure it's available, on some streaming service somewhere. But it's well worth watching. It's a fun, delightful kind of interpretation of the play. Excuse me. So, and back to the original version, this is a scene from the play of Algernon and Jack / Ernest. And I think this is the cigarette case scene is what it looks like to me. So the play premiered in 1895. As I said, to great acclaim. There were lots of famous, like the upper echelons, upper crust of society in the audience on the premiere night, which speaks to Wilde's sort of connections in the high society, and as well as the fact that people knew him as a writer, and he'd already had a couple plays performed, and people were looking forward to what he was, what it was going to be. I mean, it's like the new sort of celebrated piece. As you can see, it premiered in 1895. It ran for 86 nights. He was already well known, as I've already mentioned. It got mixed reviews. Some people who saw the play, everyone liked the play, but some critics thought it was sort of silly and trivial, and other people understood that it was making a comment about, like, it was sort of a satire, and that it was making fun of Victorian society, and sort of and very much in line with the aesthetic movement, which I'll get to later, that sort of decided that Victorianism had to go, which makes sense if you think about it. The Victorian period really starts in like the 1830s and goes up into the 1890s. That's a really long time for sort of a cultural period, where things are not identical, obviously, through that whole time period, but where there's sort of a unifying kind of stability of ideas and literary sort of artistic sorts of themes and ideas and schools of thought and aesthetic values, and as well as cultural values, as well as all those other kinds of things. So that's a long time. I mean, the Romantic period, by comparison, is only about, if you stretch it to its extremes, maybe 40 years, and that's kind of a stretch. Whereas this is like, going on 70 years. So it's a really long time for things to kind of be as stable as they are culturally. And so it's time. It's, end of the century. You can kind of understand, having lived through, well, I don't know how old you all are, but having lived through the turn of the century from the 1900s to the 2000s, there was a sense, if those of you who are a little older might remember that, there was a sense of, like, things are going to be different in this new century, right? I mean, one of the big things was there's always a doomsday kind of quality at the end of the century about whether we're coming to the end of humanity or whatever, which we certainly had in 1999. There was this whole like idea of Y2K. The computers were all going to shut down because there was some sort of glitch in, they weren't equipped to turn over into 2000, and what were we going to do? Like the entire world was going to shut down. Well, obviously that didn't happen. Um, and there wasn't even a blip as far as I remember. But there's always sort of apocalyptic thinking, but there's also always a sense of optimism at the same time of this is a new century and new things are going to happen and that kind of thing. And so there's a certain kind of, and when you get into the 90s, of any century, you're kind of in a place of change. And I would point back again to the Romantic period, which is, really 1790s is when it starts. And that, in the Revolution, like the French Revolution, particularly, you have lyrical ballads is, 1798, you have all of these things happening in the 90s, the 1790s, that are, important transitions into what's going to become, the 19th century, the 1800s. And then you have some of the same things happening at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century. So from the 1800s into the 1900s. Although the 19th century, or the 20th century, sorry, was, filled with, world wars and, some really profoundly terrifying things, which we'll get to as we move into that period. But just to kind of keep a sense of perspective, times are really beginning to shift here. Out of the sort of, very Victorian values. So in any case, that's kind of what he's very aware of this and is kind of promoting it in a sense. So, so some of the ways that the play satirizes Victorian values, and this is really all I'm going to really say about the play itself. And one of the things that on the English stage for, since the, 1660s, there are basically two major kinds of plays on the sort of what they call the legitimate stages. That was more of a little bit later thing, but like there was a point where there was government censorship of the theater because there were like kind of politically dangerous ideas, and so then after that you had to have a license to perform a play at a particular, at the what were considered the legitimate theaters, the ones that had legal standing. Then there were all these illegitimate theaters that did, like, they couldn't do like tragedies and comedies. They had to do like melodramas, so they had to incorporate music in them, or they had to have, or opera, or whatever. So there's this really interesting dichotomy, which I don't have time to go into in too much detail, but it is something that I have studied extensively as part of my dissertation and when I was a grad student, and then thereafter, it's been one of my research interests. The stage and sort of the politics of the stage and all that kind of thing. So, but there was a longstanding tradition in the theater of tragedy and comedy, which I'm sure you're familiar with those terms. Comedies were almost always marriage plots. So a comedy was almost always about a couple that wanted to get together, and there's some sort of reason that they can't get together. That some sort of outside force that blocks them from getting together. Usually it's a character like Lady Bracknell who stops the marriage because it's unsuitable for some reason, or they have some sort of ulterior motive or something, the guardian or the parent or whatever. And then the whole play is about the couple scheming to get together somehow and figuring out how to resolve the objections of the guardian, which is exactly what the Gwendolyn and Jack plot is, right? The Gwendolyn Ernest plot. So he's making fun of that. I mean, he's using that plot, but he's also making fun of it by making those characters absurd when they weren't. It's not that they weren't absurd in other comedies, but the lovers usually weren't absurd. It's usually just like the blocking character who's like a comic absurdity, whereas the lovers are usually portrayed as like are sincere. They're sincerely in love with each other. They're sincerely trying to get together. They might be funny, but they're certainly not like absurd the way that Ernest and Gwendolyn are. Same thing with Cecily and Algernon, which is in a marriage plot, there's often, like if you look at a Shakespeare play, there's often a minor couple. There's like the major couple that the story is about, and then there's often like a minor plot couple getting together as well. And then you have the same structure here. But they are, and they're always more like comic relief. Like in a Shakespeare play, they might be like, they're usually a little bit lower, like lower in the social strata. Like maybe they're the younger siblings, or they're, cousins, or they're maybe even in some of Shakespeare's plays, they might even be like the servants. Who are interested, and their relationship parallels the relationship of the main couple. And here, of course, he intertwines them, right, which is also not uncommon. So he's using a really classical structure in that sense. But then he's also like inverting it and making fun of it by making all of them absurd and making you get to the end and wondering if marriage is even worth the trouble, right? Like the play really has some questions about, why are we even doing this, right? And why do any of these things matter? So, he's also making fun of the norms of the high society in which he floated because of his social status. And he's making fun of like the idea the ideas that come from theater, but also come from real life, of a suitable marriage, and the idea that you marry for, you know, class, you marry for, to enhance the social standing of your child, which by this point is a fairly old fashioned idea. I should make that clear. It's not that there weren't still people in the upper classes who cared about that. That's probably still true in the upper classes, right? But especially in England, where there's still there's still lords and ladies and dukes and duchesses and all that kind of thing. Um, but at the same time, you can see that being eroded, right, at this time, and that those old models of, the concern about catching the best possible husband for your daughter, he's really inverting that and making fun of it here in a way that means that the culture is ready to hear that. Right, they're ready for, ready to make fun, ready to poke fun at it, and ready to see it for the absurdity that it is. Really, you can't imagine this play being performed in like 1850. People would have been like, well, why would that be wrong? Like the mother should do that. She's only protecting her daughter. Whereas by 1895, people are like, yeah, I get it. Like, she's old fashioned, right? Lady Bracknell is an old fashioned character, intended to be. So instead of being she's a blocking character, but her blocking, the very fact of her blocking, makes it feels like an anachronism, looking backwards, that is no longer necessary or appropriate. And then, of course, there's this whole idea of the play being called The Importance of Being Earnest. I want you to notice that the earnest in the title is spelled differently than the earnest of the name Ernest. Meaning that the importance of being earnest is about, the word earnest means to be sincere, to be honest, to be working from a place of sincerity, I guess is the best word I can think of. And so this play is not about that at all. This play, of course, is about the opposite of that, right? People who are shady and duplicitous and lying about where they are and lying about what they are and who they are, in lots of different ways. And so at the end, the end line of the play, of course, is, I've learned the importance of being earnest, to kind of pick up on the title. He can use that as the title then and kind of make, reinforce. It's like bookending almost. But this is also making fun of, earnestness goes hand in hand with the importance in the Victorian period of being serious, right? It's kind of, in some ways, I would say it's analogous to like our kind of where we are culturally, in the sense of like, there's been like this real emphasis, especially in the last, since the turn of the century, into the 2000s, about being like hardworking, right? Like we are all like, we have to work all the time, and it's about work, work, work. And it's kind of Victorian in a way, about like, there's not time, people are talking about how they don't have time for anything. And I'm involved in 50,000 different things. And some of you might have felt that, going through school and wanting to go to college, and having to take all the hardest classes and be in the right clubs and do the right things to get yourself into the right social position. It's very Victorian, and weirdly so. But this idea that that you have to be hardworking, and you have to take life seriously, and you can't just goof off, and this sort of dismissal of people who are trivial or don't try hard enough or whatever, is very much in line with what he's making fun of here, right? So both Algernon and Jack are incredibly trivial characters, right? They're rich men who are like, they don't have to work, they're dissolute, they have got plenty of time to like, you know, they're bored, they have plenty of time to cause trouble. They have plenty of time to worry about, cucumber sandwiches and, you know, a bunch of absurd little things that are portrayed very deliberately as trivialities, right? So there's this idea of, are those so like in the Victorian period, those are social flaws, and he's saying, he's deliberately creating characters that go against that norm. And not saying that they're heroic and not saying that triviality is great or anything like that, but just to show the absurd extremism of the Victorian emphasis on seriousness. So just for what it's worth. And then also there's a I mentioned before this class thing. The class thing is reinforced by the London place names of the characters. Like Bracknell was a place in London. It was like a neighborhood in London. Worthing was the town that um, the where Wilde himself actually lived in Worthing with his family. I mean, so the last names of the characters are not extensively, but they're all like they're all like place names, which is an indication that is lost on us, but would have been instantly recognizable to his audience, that these are the fashionable neighborhoods in London. And that sort of geography of London comes up in the whole story about that he was an orphan and he was found in a handbag, and what line was it on, and the line of the streetcar, right? The train line, because we're in trains by now, right? We're at that point in culture. All of that is just making fun of sort of the geography of London and the posh neighborhoods versus the poor neighborhoods and that kind of thing, right? So just as a way of reinforcing that sort of built in, while the Victorians see all of that, take all of that sort of social caste sort of stuff very seriously, Wilde is sort of trying to make fun of it at the same time. Even though he was of it, he's still trying to make fun of it. Okay, and then finally, as we're transitioning out of the Victorian period, Wilde was very deeply embedded as a writer, as an artist, as a creative, in the world of aestheticism, which was this idea of art for art's sake. So one of their two big like ideas were, the first of which was the critiquing. They wanted to critique Victorian art's sense of seriousness and of moral purpose. So if you think about the stuff that we've read, most of our literature, going back to like Elizabeth Barrett Browning, has been like serious in tone. It's been, wanting to make a moral statement about good behavior versus bad behavior. If you look at Robert Browning's poems and the bad behaviors of his protagonists of those poems, the dramatic monologues. If you look at Goblin Market and the morality of that is super like clear, and we already talked about that. If you even Tennyson, if you look at Elizabeth Barrett Browning, if you look at Hard Times, all of these texts have a clear sense of morality, a clear sense of right and wrong. And so by the end of the century, the younger generation of people is like getting kind of, that feels old and played out, right? They're tired of it. And so there's a sense that art doesn't need to always have like a moral purpose, right? It doesn't always need to be, instructive in some way. And if you read like deeply into Victorian literature, as I have, this idea that like stuff should be instructive, or you should learn something valuable, or it should make you have a stronger character because you read a novel, is like deeply embedded in that time. And so they're at the end of the century, these guys are like, really? Is that necessary? Or can't art just be beautiful? Does it need to be also, like all of this, high intended moral purpose? Can't it just be, beautiful? And that's where arts for art's sake comes from. And of course, this was this was happening on the continent as well. And the French were really into it. French artists and British artists were really into this idea in particular. But so those two things go together. And so you have this movement away from, art for the sake of, moral edification into art for the sake of line and aesthetic and beauty and color and design and those things that is separated from morality, right? So that's an interesting change, and one that's, I would say, still with us. I don't think that people necessarily look at design as morally valuable or look at art in quite that way, although art can certainly make a statement, a political statement or a cultural statement. I think that, that's a tension that is still within the art world for sure. Visual art as well as, writing and other things. Um, and then this moves us into, of course, the 20th century. As I was saying earlier, we're right at the end of the 19th century with all of this, but then also into the movement that's called modernism, which has very different concerns than the Victorian period did. And we'll talk about that coming up in the next few weeks.